It is an honor to be part of this group. I always enjoy whenever I can join in. And what I'm going to share with you today is some exciting discoveries that I've made in my research. Now, I should preface this by saying I'm not a real Adventist historian. I just have a very strong hobby of exploring the archives. So what I've done over time is to collect stories of people who are unknown, and many of those stories are women. And so this quarter that we're just wrapping up at PUC, I've had the opportunity to share much of that in a class called Women in Adventist History. And I've been able to host some other historians from around Adventism who have shared some of those biographies as well. I want to start with Ellen White, and then I want to share 10 bios of other women that really fell within Ellen White's sphere of influence and emerged as leaders in their own right. All right. So first, I have to get my visuals up and running. All right. Sorry for that delay. All right, forgotten women who shaped Adventism. As we go into this topic, it's clear that Ellen White is the most widely known woman in Adventist history. If you ask somebody for a name of somebody in Adventist history who is a woman who led at a high level, it's definitely going to be Ellen White that most people give as the answer. But there were quite a few others, and that's the intriguing part of this story, is that those many others are often not acknowledged in today's world, and yet in their time, they were often household names. So it's not as if during their lifetime, when they were ministering and contributing and shaping this developing Advent movement, that they were necessarily ignored. But even in that, you'll find as we go through some of these bios that there's some tension between this very affirming approach to women in leadership that is part of Adventism and the gender norms that they often bump up against as barriers to further advancement in leadership. So there's a bit of tension, and I want to name that right from the beginning. But starting with this woman here, Ellen White. We could probably name a number of spheres of influence. If you're around Adventism, you've been around Adventism for a while, you certainly know that Ellen White had quite a bit of influence. And some of those areas were strategic development. It was Ellen White who was often suggesting the new thing. We often, I think we miss this in today's world because many of us grew up in the Adventist faith, and Ellen White is that picture of conservatism, of traditionalism. We get quotes from Ellen White, and it's usually to push us back into the old ways. But in her time, she was the innovator, and she would suggest new developments, such as a publishing work, or hospitals, or educational institutions, and a wide array of other things. Most Adventist institutions from this time period can trace some of their development, if not a great deal of their development, to Ellen White. So she has this strategic development component. She also provided pulpit leadership. And this began right after the Great Disappointment when she had her first vision, and it was a vision that provided some encouragement for the scattered flock. And so she would get a number of different invitations to share, and as time went on, she continued to preach other messages as well. And so Ellen White throughout her lifetime was the pulpiteer, and her husband James, the story is told that he was pretty good, but she was the one who was asked to preach more often than he was. And Ellen White's influence also extended to spiritual advisory in personal matters. As I've sorted through the archives and especially enjoyed reading letters that are available on ellenwhite.org, it's amazing to me how many people were writing to Ellen White in order to ask advice on just a wide range of things. Quite often questions related to their participation in the mission. Should we go and do this, or should we go do this? And she would not always answer those letters personally. She would have Willie or someone else do it because there were just so many. So the spiritual advisory role. Ellen White was certainly significant in that. And of course, point number 4 there, we're familiar with her extensive writing, which continues to influence Adventists today. But a component of Ellen White's leadership that is not as widely acknowledged over the last 20 years or so, it's become more and more apparent, I think. And that is the story of her credentialing in the denomination. And before we really try to absorb what that's all about, we need to understand what credentialing is. It is an official endorsement from the organization saying this person is one of us. This person represents us, okay? So I want to share just a little bit on her credentialing, again, to make the point that Ellen White had this extensive influence and it was recognized during her lifetime. The first ministerial credential that we find referenced is in 1871. I should actually amend that. Someone else even here might know of something earlier, but I know of 1871. We have this report in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, right in the middle of the screen. You can see it there where it says moved and voted that Sister Ellen G. White receive credentials. Now fixate on that word, credentials, from this conference. The reason why I say fixate on that word credentials is that there are two terms at play here. One is credential and one is license. And if you look in the previous paragraph, you see that there was also a motion that these various individuals receive credentials, and they are the ordained ministers of the time. James White, Joseph Bates, John Byington, our first General Conference president. You see some other names that you might recognize. So credential means an ordination credential. To further confirm that, if you go down 2 paragraphs below the vote to give Ellen White this credential, it says on motion, it was voted that the following brethren receive license and that they be recommended to receive ordination as ministers. So they're receiving a license, it's the lesser recognition, and they're on the track to receive ordination. So that's 1871, 10 years before James died. The year that James died, 1881, we find this small record in the Review and Herald. And it's a motion that had come to the floor. Before we can fully understand this, I think it's important to understand that there was a lead up to this. James White died earlier in 1881, and some have construed this to mean that this motion was here because James had died and they wanted some way to take care of Ellen and continue her pay. That doesn't really check out because there was a lead up to this 1881 General Conference session in which people like Ellen White and John Andrews and Joseph Wagner and others were writing a flurry of articles in support of wider roles for women in ministry. And it culminates in 1881 at this General Conference session. And here's the resolution. Resolved that females possessing the necessary qualifications to fill that position may with perfect propriety be set apart by ordination to the work of the Christian ministry. 1881. There's some debate as to what happened to this resolution afterwards, but I think the most important point is that they are proposing this at a General Conference session in 1881. That's pretty early in our history. Now, the story gets more interesting from here because I was told by a number of people over time that in 1885 or so, there was one ordination credential that Ellen White received, and the word ordained was neatly crossed out because they didn't want her to be misrepresented as an ordained minister, and they didn't have another form, so they just modified it by this means, okay? That's the story that I've heard repeated over and over and over again. A credential, and the word ordained was crossed out. All right, so they're talking about this one here. You can see down at the bottom, it says 1885. And on the second line of text up there, you see it says ordained minister. Starting from the top, this is to certify that Mrs. E.G. White of Healdsburg, California, is an ordained minister. And you look closely and you see, yes, that word ordained has been tampered with in some way by somebody at some point in history. Okay, so it's settled. They didn't want her to be ordained. That's the story. Except that very same year, Michigan Conference, that was the General Conference, but Michigan Conference also issued her a credential. You see the date down at the bottom, 1885. And on that second line of text, it says ordained minister, and there's no tampering with that word. Then you go back to 1883, which would have been the next credentialing period, I believe, after 1881 and that resolution to ordain women, and you have ordained minister. But again, her credential, her ordination credential goes back to 1871 at least. And again, if someone knows more history than that, I'd love to hear it. And this continues. 1887, Mrs. E.G. White, ordained minister. Here's a copy from 1899. We don't have copies from all the different periods. You wouldn't expect to necessarily. But it says across the top, ordained minister, Mrs. E.G. White, 1899. There's 1909, ordained minister, Mrs. E.G. White. And 1913, 2 years before her death, ordained minister, E.G. White. So what this means is that for 44 years, the Seventh-day Adventist denomination was comfortable saying in writing that Ellen White was one of our ordained ministers. I think that's significant. If there was a theological objection to the idea of ordaining women, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have done that. Somewhere, somebody along the way would have said, oh no, we shouldn't be doing that anymore. But for 44 years, we continued to do so. Now, there are a couple of other nuances to this. Those final 2 points there on the screen. In the yearbooks, she's classified consistently as one of the ordained ministers. And there is a variation a little bit in the biographical form of 1909, where one of the secretaries filled it out. And when it came to the line about ordination date, they just put an X. So some have said that means she wasn't ordained. More likely, there are two possibilities here. One is that, yeah, she wasn't ordained, considered ordained. The other is that there was never an official ceremony. And given the evidence I've just shared with you, I think you can decide which one that is. So there's Ellen White. And the natural question for us to ponder at this point in the story is, why would a church that started out with a prominent leader like Ellen White struggle today with women in leadership? With that question, why would we even be pondering the question? Why would it even be, there be a question mark on that? Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I can answer it fully, but I hope that in our discussion, we can address that and explore that some. How is this possible? Right now, I want to share with you 10 brief bios, 10, of women who were within Ellen White's sphere, who grew up as leaders as well in their own right. And I've done kind of attempted to divide this into 5 areas: publishing, healthcare, education, conference leadership, and local church leadership in terms of being local pastors. And I'll tell you right at the start, this is a bit of a fool's errand, because you will quickly see that most of these women actually touched on a number of these different spheres. Nonetheless, I want to highlight the fact that these 5 major arenas of Adventism were all shaped in some part by significant women during this period. Okay, so first of all, publishing. I want to talk about Annie Smith and Maud Sisley Boyd. Annie Smith did not live a long time, but her time in Adventism left a significant mark, and it was in the publishing sphere, writing as well as editing. She lived from 1828 to 1855. At the tender age of 10, she accepted Jesus into her life became a very fervent Christian, and she just had this kind of sweet Christian faith at the age of 10 that carried forward over the years. And in 1844, early in 1844, her family accepted the message of William Miller, and they were excited and anticipating the second coming of Jesus on October 22, 1844. But of course, we know the sad story. It was called the Great Disappointment for a reason, and Annie was deeply disappointed. There's no indication that she entirely walked away from God, but she decided to invest in other things. And so she began to be a teacher, and she also started to attend some female seminaries up in the Boston area. This is a picture of the Charlestown Female Seminary where she attended, and actually this is a picture drawn by her. She was studying art, specifically painting, and she was planning to be a teacher for a career. So she was investing her life in this new direction of becoming a teacher. Sadly, when she was just wrapping up her studies there, she had some serious issues with her eyesight. And her mother says it was because she was drawing a picture of Boston from a hillside, and the sun was too much over the days that she was working on this picture, and it injured her eyes. That's possible, but her mother also had some interesting theories about medical things. So I'm not sure what was happening, but she lost her eyesight. And it was extremely sad because a female seminary, actually invited her to come teach. And she had to say no, because a blind art teacher, that would be hard to do. And so she kind of wandered and struggled for a little bit. But during this time, you have to understand something about these female seminaries. This was a movement in New England about this time to train women. It was in some ways a feminist movement, probably not in the same sense we would understand feminism today, but the idea was that women had potential intellectually, they had potential outside the home, and so we should give them the opportunity to have education so that they can pursue those opportunities. And she was very much within this stream. She was involved in a publication called The Lady's Wreath, which often would express some of these very liberating ideas. So I would like to claim Annie Smith as a feminist, at least for her time, okay? And she was hoping to have a career of her own, but that didn't work out, and she was struggling. One day, her mother wrote her a letter and asked her to please go and hear Joseph Bates preach, because her mother had come around to this developing Seventh-day Adventism. And just to please her mother, and because she had nothing else to do, she went into the meeting. The night before, though, she had a dream about coming into a meeting, and there was only one seat available near the door, and she sat down, and then the speaker spoke about the sanctuary. Well, that night before, Joseph Bates also had a dream about a girl coming in, taking the last seat, and he was speaking about the sanctuary. So he changed his topic to the sanctuary, and this led to her conversion, because it seemed as though God did care about her, God was still active. So she wrote it into a poem. And here is the poem that she wrote. She sent it off to James White at the Advent Review in 1851. And she captured her faith experience in this poem. And this became one of her primary contributions, not this poem in particular, but her poetry. It developed into quite a number of Adventist hymns. The previous Adventist hymnal had 10 of them, I believe, and the current one has 3 of her hymns. This here is the poem that was capturing the disappointment of 1844 and then kind of a renewed faith. And it begins, "Fear not, little flock, for Christ is our rock. The promise stands sure. The kingdom he'll give to the same that endure. The armor gird on till victory is won. Let us manfully fight." In this context of this conversation, that word manfully is an interesting choice. "The millennial morn soon will end time's dark night. The truth will prevail. Its beamings we hail, and is mighty in power." And then she goes on to actually capture some of the Adventist faith. You can see the word Sabbath there and the sacred law. And this captures James White's imagination. And he invites Annie to come edit at the review. She writes back, sadly, I can't help because I can't see very well. My eyesight is basically gone. And James says, please come anyway. So she travels to Battle Creek and she joins at the review office and she tries to do the best she can and help with odd jobs. And then they have a special prayer and anointing over her, and her eyesight got better. And so she begins to edit the review when James is gone. You know, James was a perfectionist, so she must have been good at this. Also during her time, they developed the youth's instructor, and she becomes the first editor of the youth's instructor. So she makes some very potent contributions during this early time, but her lasting contribution is in terms of poetry and the hymns she wrote. Here's one that you might know, called The Blessed Hope. I saw one weary, sad and torn, with eager steps pressed on the way, who long the hallowed cross had borne, still looking for the promised day. While many a line of grief and care upon his brow was furrowed there, I asked what buoyed his spirits up. Oh, this, said he, the blessed hope. Adventist tradition suggests a variety of different interpretations of this. One is that this first verse refers to Joseph Bates, who led her back into the faith. The next one to James White. And then the third is suggested might actually be her, but encased in masculine pronouns. Okay, and then the final verse is about all of us. That's a hymn that many of you no doubt have sung. So her contribution, again, was to capture this Advent faith in a way that allowed her, or allowed the people to feel and to really be inspired, okay? Now, when she's on her deathbed, she's scrambling to put together her book of poetry because she knows that's her contribution, and she finished it just a few days before she died. She also finished a little poem that was meant to give perspective on her own death. And I think it encapsulates, it really captures her type of contribution, expressing faith through poetry. You see that she died at age 27. Just going down to the poetry there, here's what she wrote. Oh, shed not a tear o'er the spot where I sleep. For the living and not for the dead ye may weep. Why mourn for the weary who sweetly repose, free in the grave from life's burden of woes? I long now to rest in the lone quiet tomb, for the footsteps of Jesus have lightened its gloom. I die in the hope of soon meeting again the friends that I love, with him ever to reign. So that's Annie Smith. A significant contribution to the early publishing efforts, even though her life was very short. Another one who was involved in publishing and a whole lot else was Maud Sisley Boyd. I want you to picture a scene in 1922 in San Francisco. It's the General Conference session. It's a very contentious General Conference session. A.G. Daniels has just been ousted and Spicer has been put in. And Spicer is giving his speech on the last day of the session. And as he's gearing up to give his speech, he says, I want to announce that there is somebody here with us. Mrs. Maud Sisley Boyd, our first female missionary, is with us today. Please stand to your feet. And she stands, and everyone bursts into applause because Maud Sisley Boyd was a household name in Adventism in 1922. Now, I won't ask for a poll, but how many of you have heard of her? No doubt some of you have, but she's no longer a household name like Joseph Bates or James White, but she should be. She was there in 1863 for the organization of the General Conference. She was only 11 years old, but she was there for the meeting and must have been inspired by the missional fervor that was present there. In 1868, at the age of about 16, 17, I guess, she began to work at the Review and Herald as a typesetter, and then she continued on into other tasks like editing and even some writing shortly thereafter. And as she was there in Battle Creek, very much part of the mission, joining with the worships each day as the whites would come and give worships to the crew, her missional fervor just grew. One day, Stephen Haskell came into town and was agitating the young people of which she was a part, with this idea of really being mission focused and spreading out the literature that they were publishing. And so she and a few friends put together the first tract society in 1870. She was part of the first school in 1872. And after 10 years at the press, she and a friend, Elsie Gates, funded themselves to go for 6 months to Ohio to do missionary work. And of course, during that time, Joseph Wagner came into town and did a tent meeting, of course, took credit for all the work they had done. I don't think he meant to, but he gets credit for that tent meeting, even though these two ladies did the groundwork. Later that year, though, it seems that the brethren recognized that she was a significant contributor and could be doing more, and so they called her to Switzerland. Now, in Switzerland in 1874, John Andrews had been sent there to get the work started. By 1877, he was still struggling to get the printing business off the ground, to spread the word through that means. And so they send Maud over there to get things in order, and she does. After 2 years there, John Loughborough is sent off to England to organize the work there. Again, another first. And shortly, he recognizes he's in over his head, and he asks if Maud can come help. After some time there, she comes back to the United States, marries Charles L. Boyd, and after this, she is often referred to as Mr. C.L. Boyd and wife. This is an interesting phenomenon. Many of these women contributed very significantly to the work prior to being married. But as soon as they're married, it's just assumed they're now domestic help, and they're relegated to Mrs. C.L. Boyd or Mr. C.L. Boyd and wife. Okay, so that's an interesting dimension in terms of the gender norms and how they serve as barriers for these women and their potential. But she does work very hard alongside her husband, and she is contributing in her own right, but not getting enough credit for it. Over in Washington State in 1883, they head over there. And in 1883, as they go to Washington State and begin to do some pioneering work there, Ellen White writes her and her husband an interesting letter in which she says, "You two, neither of you lacks self-confidence." So in order for your marriage to thrive and your work to thrive, you probably need to dial that back just a bit. Frankly, this helps me to love Maud even more. She's a very driven person. She's a very capable person, and she's not afraid to put herself out there and make that difference. She doesn't lack self-confidence, as Ellen White described it. After their time in Washington State doing pioneering work there, they go to South Africa in 1887 to join the very first Adventist missionaries there. And then in 1899, after her husband dies, Ellen White writes to her and specifically asks her to come to Australia to help with the fledgling effort to start Avondale College there. And so Maud Sisley Boyd is a woman of firsts. She was at the first General Conference session. She was part of creating the first tract society in Battle Creek. She was part of the first church school. She was one of the first to work on the mission in Ohio. She was among the first to go to Switzerland and the first female, single female missionary sent by the denomination. She was there for the first work, official work in England. And she was there among the first missionaries in South Africa. And Washington, I suppose we could say she was among the first. She's there for the first college effort there in Australia in 1889. Here she is with her husband, Charles Boyd, and her daughter, Ella. And there she is around 1937, which was the year in which she died. So in the publishing work, we can see very clearly their contributions of women. And these are just two samples. There are quite a few others that we could talk about as well, but I've just given you a sample, and I need to move a little faster through some of the rest of this. As far as healthcare is concerned, another major component of the Adventist mission, we could talk about a number of people, but here are two. Anna Carlson Stahl. At age 16, she took the initiative to come to America from her native Sweden, traveled here all by herself, borrowed a little money from her brother, but mostly funded the trip herself as well. And after some time working here in America, she met a young German man named Ferdinand Stahl, and they got married. She was working as a waitress, and these two men kept coming in every day. And one was this flamboyant Frenchman, and the other was this very reserved and all business sort of German. And apparently she was drawn to the German. It's okay. It's all right. She was all business, I guess. And so they head off to Battle Creek College. Here's a picture of Battle Creek College. And the plan is for both of them to serve as nurses. So Ferdinand enrolls and Anna tries to enroll. But by this time, she's married and she has a daughter, and they won't let her study nursing. It's a waste of time. Why would we train you? You're just a homemaker. So we see another one of those gender norm barriers that were getting in the way even of these women who were pioneering during this time. One day she was helping the matron put up some drapes and things, and the matron thanked her for her extensive help. And Anna said, "I'm glad that I could help, but that's not why I came here." And they talked about the nursing program, and the matron put in a word, and she was able to study there. But before she was done with her study, her husband had a job in Cleveland, Ohio, working with some treatment rooms there. And so her husband wants to leave, and she says, wait, I haven't finished my studies. And so, what do we do? Well, they are making an arrangement that she can get some credit for the work she's about to do in Cleveland in the treatment room so she can finish her degree. And that was, I guess, good. But after some time there's a growing sense between Anna and her husband that they want to be part of the organized work, not this sort of peripheral thing that they're doing. So they send a letter off to Ellen White. And as far as I know, they didn't actually know, but she was the spiritual advisor, and ask for advice. And she advises them to go to the 1909 General Conference session. So they go there and they talk to the president of the region down in South America, and they offer their services. Well, the president says, "I would love to have you, but I don't have any money to send you there. If you could get there, then we could use you." So they pay their own way, and they land in Peru in a ship like this one. And this is the way you get to shore in Molindo Bay there in Peru by a crane. Anna objected to this, and so instead they opted for a little boat that bounced on the swells against the side of the ship. She wasn't sure it was a good idea after all. But besides the excitement of arrival, what they notice as they are on the eastern side of Lake Titicaca in La Paz, they notice that the Quechua and Aymara local peoples are being significantly downtrodden by the upper 5% of society. So the 95% are struggling, while the 5% are abusing and using the local indigenous people. And this disturbs them. Anna, with her nursing abilities, starts to connect with the rich and powerful. She treats the daughter-in-law of the president of Bolivia, and as time goes on, she gets to know a number of people in the government of Peru as well. And by offering good nursing care, she makes powerful friends. And the Stalls together leverage this to create a transformation in the Lake Titicaca region that is still referred to today. There are a number of schools and hospitals in particular named after them. And there's still at times the children in the schools sing songs about the Stalls. Charles Teal has documented this in some significant academic articles, and I encourage you to explore that if you're curious about the Stalls. But they were, Anna used her nursing abilities to be able to make the connections to make those differences. And they built a school system of over 200 schools. They built markets. They got money for bridges and roads. They built the local economy, and it transformed the region. The clinic that Anna started in 1911 started kind of rough. They were hesitant to come in, but after a while, they started coming in for help, and they would bring their guns. You can see in this picture, they have rifles. So some interesting adventures, but we can't talk about all of that. Another one that we should mention in the healthcare realm is Dr. Ruth Temple. She graduated from Loma Linda College. She was the first Black female doctor in California. It was estimated that she delivered 300 babies per month during her early work in Los Angeles. That might be an exaggeration because it's hard to imagine how that would be possible, but the point was that she made a huge difference. And she basically built medical infrastructure in underserved communities. She helped to cure the plague when it came through the area. She helped with the flu epidemic and some others. And probably the most significant thing we can say about Ruth Temple is that she was famous outside of the church as well. She is known in California history as a major developer of the community. There she is giving a vaccine to a child who doesn't seem pleased with the idea, but it was good for the child anyway. And there she is in her older age. So healthcare, women contributed significantly to healthcare. Then another major arena of the Adventist mission is education. And here are two examples of that. This is Alma McKibben. She had her own journey with education as a young child. A teacher told her she was dumb and couldn't succeed, just didn't have the brain for it. She believed that until another teacher came along and told her that she could succeed and proved it to her. And that changed the direction of her life. She wanted to become a teacher and be a good teacher who would empower kids. And so she would take notes on the teacher's techniques along the way. She was preparing to be a teacher. In 1892, she got married. It was believed that she was going to die. She ended up living to almost 103, but believed that she was going to die. And so she married Edwin McKibben. Ended up that he died shortly thereafter. But she initially refused his proposal because she believed she needed to work in order to fund her two sisters through school. Her family situation was a mess. And she believed, it seems, that if she got married, she wouldn't be able to work outside the home. Interesting gender dynamic there. But she did marry him, and he became sick with tuberculosis. So she taught all of his college classes for a time. And then after that, after her husband died and her child died, she moved down to Southern California, and she was reading some material that Ellen White was writing about education from out in Australia. And she was getting inspired about making the Bible the center of curriculum. So she began to develop a bit of curriculum. She did some tutoring of local kids, and those local kids' parents decided that she should start a school. Well, she didn't want to start a school if she couldn't do it well. So she ran away and hid. And then one day, as she was attending church, the visiting preacher recognized her and had a note sent to her saying, "Stay by afterwards because I want to talk to you." Well, she knew what was up. They wanted her to be a school teacher, and she didn't want to do it if she couldn't do it well. And so she left before the end of the closing hymn. The next week, the same speaker was there, and he sent another note. And this time she left before the closing hymn even started. But a deacon followed her home and wrote down her address, and he visited the next day. And it's a big story, but she was resistant again because she wanted to do it only if she could do it well. She ended up in 1898 teaching a school that they slapped together with boards, just a small little structure addition to another building. And the cold winds blew through. And at Christmas time, she asked them to give her some insulation to finish building it so the wind wouldn't blow through. Unfortunately, that meant that they used up their money and they couldn't pay her anymore. But she kept her commitment and she stayed with the school throughout that school year. Well, after that trial by fire, Alma was interested in some teacher training. She was the first school teacher in the state of California, first Adventist school teacher. And she thought, well, this would be great if I could have some training. And they were just training a bunch of teachers the next year. Unfortunately, just before that training began, M.E. Cady came in and said, I have to be away and I'm supposed to do this training. Can you do it? So instead of being trained, she got to be the trainer. And every day she would write a new lesson and she would give it to the teachers. And by this, she began to build the first Seventh-day Adventist curriculum, and she just continued from there. Okay, so she's credited with having written the first Seventh-day Adventist curriculum. There she is in older age. And here's an article celebrating her 100th birthday, and I won't read that now because I'm looking at the clock and we need to keep moving. Another educator was Anna Knight. Her father was an interesting figure. Mr. Newton Knight led a rebellion against the Confederacy and established what was known as the Free State of Jones in 1863. So this may signal some of where she got her own independence. Because she was Black, or she was mixed race, but categorized as Black in the time and had all the disadvantages of that, she was not able to go to school, not allowed to go to school. So she self-taught, asking the other students who could go to school what they had learned, and she practiced her writing in the sand and things like this, and she began to tutor neighbor kids as well. Her family didn't become Seventh-day Adventists as soon as she did. How she became Seventh-day Adventist was that she wrote to a publication up in New England asking for reading materials for her self-education process. And a couple of Adventists responded with signs of the times, and that led to a relationship, which ultimately led her to Graysville in 1893, where she was baptized, and she began school there, sponsored by some Adventists. Then the people found out that she was Black. And some of the parents were up in arms that their kids were being endangered because there was a Black girl at the school, and she could no longer study there normally. But the matron tutored her for the rest of the school year, and then she went off to Mount Vernon Academy and was able to finish her school. Ultimately, she graduated from Battle Creek College in 1898. There she is, looking good in her graduation clothing. And she went back to her home area and started a school in Gatineau, Mississippi, which was going to provide education for those that were robbed of it by the other schools. In 1901, she went to the General Conference session as a delegate because John Harvey Kellogg asked her to, and she ended up being sent to India as a missionary for a few years, and that went well. But while she was gone, her little school was burned down, and so she came back to rebuild it. The reason it was burned down is that she was angering some of the local bootleggers by her prohibition stance. So she rebuilt it, and then she became education leader for some of the more than one of the conferences down there, including the Union. And while in Atlanta, she opened, along with some other women, the first WCA that was available to Black women, which was a significant contribution that came about because she was the first Black female missionary, actually first Black missionary to India. And that got her a lot of speaking engagements in the local Black churches of various denominational backgrounds. And she built relationships, and that was how she was able to do some of that civic innovation. All right, so there's education. What about conference leadership? Well, there were many. Here's Miss Sarah Peck, who was an educator through and through. But if you hear about Miss Sarah Peck, you will hear that she was one of Ellen White's assistants. Well, I want to tell you that Miss Sarah Peck served the church for about 8 decades, and she was only Ellen White's assistant for about 6 years of that, which I think might speak to another gender dynamic where we've allowed Ellen White to be kind of an honorary man in order to dismiss the fact that she was such a significant leader. And so it's okay that these other women were just helping Ellen White out. But actually 6 years compared to the 80 years of service, I think Sarah was a leader in her own right. She graduated Battle Creek College in 1888. There was a new prep school that was being developed in Minnesota that year, and she was one of 3 teachers chosen to go there. Shortly thereafter, there was a new college being built in South Africa, Claremont, and she was one of 3 teachers chosen to go there and develop that school. And in 1898, Ellen White managed to lure her to Australia to help with the starting of Avondale. She had been trying for a couple of years, and finally Sarah agreed to it. And that's where she became Ellen White's assistant for a few years. But after that, she became education secretary for the West Coast in 1905, again, working with the conference. She went to Union College and served for about 10 years training teachers, then came back as education secretary in 1915, and then in 1918 began to serve on the General Conference Curriculum Committee, and she wrote many books that formed part of the Seventh-day Adventist curriculum. So here's the reference to the school there in Minnesota, and we see her name in about the middle of the paragraph, and it talks about how these teachers are an answer to prayer. And I'm going quickly, I recognize, but just want you to see it. South Africa, similar report from the mission field. And this one's interesting to read, so I'll read a bit of it. When we decided to build the school, he says, we were reminded of the old saying, here's your church and here's your steeple, but where's your people? We thought, here's our school building and here are our students, but where are our teachers? In our extremity, we appealed earnestly to the General Conference Committee, which we felt was almost like presumption on our part, inasmuch as we had entered upon so large an enterprise without the opportunity of their counsel. But after laying the matter fully before them and waiting patiently until they had considered the question carefully, our hearts were all made to rejoice to learn of the generosity on the part of the committee in responding to the wants of the cause in this far-off land. We had a regular time of rejoicing when we learned that it was decided that Professor Miller and wife, there's an and wife, Professor Lindsay and Miss Peck had been selected to come here. And they express how the Lord is clearly blessing them in this. There's a picture of Sarah in Australia. Again, just one of Ellen White's assistants. She's the one in the middle at the table. And a few other periodicals that I won't read. Here's an example of how she became a bit of a legend later on. This is an article by a PUC student interviewing her at age 100. And she's giving a lot of the history that's accurate. Sarah did some amazing things, and then some. There are some additions that are not quite accurate. So I'll just fly through all of that here. It does say there, the last of the 20 books she authored is The Pathway to the Throne of God. So 20 books. That's quite a contribution to Adventist curriculum. But again, she's an example of somebody who worked in the conference level in the California conference as well as at the General Conference. Somebody who was almost exclusively at the conference level was Flora Fate Plummer. She was married, as you can see, her maiden name was Fate, but her husband, Mr. Plummer, was not an Adventist. And I think that made it possible for her to lead at a higher level in the church, because the same assumptions about gender norms were not as present, perhaps. Whatever the case, she was drawn into the faith. And there's a good story behind that I don't have time to tell, but she started almost immediately in the Sabbath school work in 1886 in Iowa. She was put on a committee in 1901 to study what to do with young people. And in the end, she describes how she remembers the meetings, earnest prayer and all of that, which I, again, don't have time to read all of that. And in the end, they decide that they're going to join the young people's work with the Sabbath school work. This is a fundamental decision that shaped what Sabbath school would become in our time. And because of her work during Sabbath school, she would later go on to the General Conference Sabbath School Department, where she spent most of her career. But before she left Iowa, there's an interesting little tidbit. The president left, and they asked somebody else to be the president, who declined. And so for about a year, Flora was the acting president of the Iowa Conference. And it seemed that the committee was not in a hurry to find her replacement because she was doing just fine. She went to the General Conference Sabbath School Departments in 1905. She became the director in 1913, and that created an interesting dynamic where she was on the General Conference Committee. Now, what do you notice about this picture of the General Conference Committee from 1913? Just answer quietly, because I don't think you can unmute at this point. Well, one of these things is not like the others. Here's Flora. She is the only woman on the General Conference Committee at this point, and this lasted more than 20 years, where she was the only woman there. But while she's doing the Sabbath school work, she is forming Sabbath school as we know it today. You can see on this list here, there are a number of different materials that are being created out of her department. And the first one is, doesn't give an author credit, but she was creating that. The next one is by Miss L. Flora Plummer. The next one is by Mrs. L. Flora Plummer. The next one is an Ellen White compilation. And then, oh, there's somebody else wrote something. And then the last one is by Mrs. L. Flora Plummer. So she was writing Sabbath School Quarterlies. She was writing Teacher's Help. She was creating the Sabbath School as we know it today. Okay. I don't think I'm overstating that in any way. And one of the components of Sabbath School was that they began to fund missionaries abroad. Here's one of the advertisements from that period that was again created by her, or at least her department. And she was well known outside of the church. Her name appears in the newspaper often. Here's a report on a large camp meeting. And notice what it says about the speakers. The following prominent members of the church will be present. Prominent members, note, will be present and address the camp meeting. A.G. Daniels, president of the General Conference. Okay, that's a big name. J.A. Bunsen, missionary to Japan. Elder W.A. Spicer, also a big name. And Miss L. Flora Plummer, Minneapolis. And this is just an example. She would often appear among the big names of the denomination. All right, finally, the church. There were several women who served as pastors of the church, and overtly so. It wasn't just this kind of makeshift scenario like, well, technically they were the pastor for a while. No. These women often planted the churches, and in some cases, they were assigned to districts. One example is Minnie Sipe. And there's a great biography of her in Josephine Benton's book, Called by God, if you would like to go deeper into her story. But I want to highlight a couple of things here. Minnie Sipe was simply self-motivated. She was a shy farm girl. She married Logan Sipe, who was a Seventh-day Adventist, and over a bit of time became a Seventh-day Adventist herself. And when she did, she wanted to share this faith. So they had to travel by wagon 7 miles to church. And on the way back, she would stop and visit with people. And on the way back, especially, she would distribute the various Sabbath school papers to all the kids. And that led to the kids coming and joining next week and climbing on the wagon. And sometimes the wagon was pretty full. But she went further than that. She would begin to do Bible studies. And she set aside Thursday as her personal missionary day. Again, not in any way prompted to do this by the conference. She's not paid by the conference. She just has her Thursday missionary day. She noticed that the neighbors would come and visit sometimes, and she was busy. So she figured out a way to use that time while they were visiting too long, and she would keep quilt blocks nearby so she could work on the quilt blocks, put the quilts together, and sell those to buy more literature to distribute on Thursdays. She also would can extra food so that she could host people at her home, and while they were there at her home, she could draw them into Bible studies, okay? So then her husband went to work for the mines in Oklahoma. And when they got to Oklahoma, naturally, she's doing her thing, and she's evangelizing, and she draws a group together. It's a hard year. There's a big drought, but she draws a group together, inspires them with hope. And in 1902, early 1902, she writes to the Oklahoma conference and says, I have a church here if you'd like to organize it. Well, they're duly impressed, and they send her actually $25 as a thank you for the work she's been doing. And they invite her to become evangelist for the conference, and her husband to be her assistant, a tent master and stuff, but she'll be the preacher. And they wrestle over it. They don't have really good economic prospects, so they agree to it. She says it seemed like it's the call of God. But notice how she struggled during her first interaction as the new evangelist. She went into a town, I think this is the Ruth Church, and the people there are discouraged because there are questions being raised about the law of God. And so the local elder says, you have to come teach us. You have to do a lecture on this. And she said, I don't think I can. He says, I'm going to set my son out to go invite everybody. You go and pray and prepare for this. So she describes what happens. I went down into a big canyon close to his home. I prayed and studied. The burden for souls rested upon me. I felt my inability and cried to God. That night, a house full was ready to hear. I did the best I could. God gave me freedom and the attention of the people. They asked me to come back. I promised to come back in 2 weeks. They also told me what subject they wanted me to talk. I went home, determined to study hard and prepare for the next visit. When I came back, I found a large number of people gathered. So this is very interesting. She says, after the meeting, a young lady came up to me and spoke about my sermon. Now, notice her reaction. This, again, goes to gender norms and some of the barriers that even these women who contributed felt themselves up against. This is an internal barrier. This was the first time it had entered my head that I was really preaching. People began to call for me to come here and there to hold meetings. I was called the woman preacher. This was a great trial, for I had never admired a woman preacher. One day, when I was praying over the situation, the mountains of opposition, public criticism, and adverse public opinion that would have to be met came up before me. I was in great despair and cried, "Oh Lord, I never do this." While I was crying before the Lord, a strong impression came over me. I knew it was from God. My grace is sufficient, he said. Okay. I got up from my knees, determined to do whatever my hand found to do and leave the result to God. She also recounts another time where, now that she's gained her confidence that it's okay for there to be a woman preacher and for her to give sermons, there's a local Methodist minister who has not come around to that view and is agitating against her. And so he's challenging her, and she offers that they could share the stage together and have it out publicly and have this conversation. And he says, no, I'll never share a stage with a woman. And so she gives her own presentation, and he stands up at the end and says, I'm going to review this presentation tomorrow night, so come back. And he does. And then at the end of his, she announces she's going to review his presentation the following night, so she knows how to give it back. But notice her defense of women in ministry. And I think this is worth the time to soak in. We went to the schoolhouse early Monday evening and found the house already well filled. The people could not find even standing room. The doors were thrown open. The Methodist minister was not present. I invited the Christian minister to the front seat. After opening the meeting with song and prayer, I announced that I had tried to make peace with my brother, the minister, but found that nothing but a public answer to his opposition would suffice. And he's opposing the fact that she's a woman. So now I was ready to defend myself as a woman. I said, I got my commission from Jesus himself. This is her opening argument. He commissioned Mary after his resurrection to go and tell the brethren that he had risen. I continued, I am following in Mary's footsteps, telling the people that he is coming again. Paul, in the 16th chapter of Romans, she continues, recommends a number of women's workers, especially Phoebe, whom he asks the church to assist. I also told them that Priscilla and Aquila were Paul's co-laborers in the gospel, and that at one time Paul sent a brother to them that they might more fully teach him the way to eternal life. The Bible mentions the following women leaders: Miriam, who assisted Moses, Deborah, who led the forces of Israel, Anna, who was a prophetess in the house of God. Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. Others might be mentioned. It is true that women are told in a certain chapter to keep silent in the case of confusion, but in the same chapter, men are told to keep silent on certain occasions. I also quoted Acts 2:17 and 18, and told my brother in the ministry that he was behind the times, and that all civilization was coming to realize that woman is to be man's helpmeet in every good work. God created woman to stand by the side of man. He did not take a part of man's feet to create woman to show that he should rule over her. Neither did he take a part of man's brain to show that woman should rule over the man, but he took a rib from his side, showing that she should stand by his side, that they should work together to advance the cause of right in the world. And then she goes on and associates women being subjugated to heathen countries and things like this, right? So you get the fact that she has come around to a philosophical perspective. And what I find interesting about that is that her philosophical perspective shifted in favor of women in leadership after she experienced her own call. I find that intriguing. All right. Well, there was that accidental church plant that got her the job. She, as an evangelist in 1902, she was a reluctant debater. There's an interesting story about how she holds her own in a debate, even though she tried to avoid it. But in the end, she served in 8 states, plus the Bahamas, probably some others too. She pastored many churches. And later in life, after her first husband died, she remarried again at the age of 61. And the conference served her with papers of retirement. Now, she's working in a different conference than had hired her at the beginning. This is Upper Columbia Conference now. Because I think they felt like now she had a man who could take care of her. I find that, again, an interesting barrier that she's bumping up against. Well, she continued to do ministry. She ended up going to the Bahamas. She worked it out, but it was an unfortunate incident. Brief sample here, just so we understand that she was very much a district pastor. This is her writing in the newspaper. Seventh-day Adventists notice. I've been located in Kennewick since April and have enjoyed my short stay. The reason for my short stay is that the conference committee in council decided to conserve their force due to conditions in the financial world, and in doing so concluded to keep Kennewick back to the Granger district, Pasco in the Walla Walla district, asked students from the college to assist in the district leaders of Walla Walla College. They asked me to take the Lower Columbia district, which consists of Pendleton, Hermiston, Ione, and Boardman. I have been pleased with the little churches and people in part of the vineyard. And notice how she signs this little report. Mrs. Minisight, pastor, SDA Church. She was distinctly a local pastor. All right. One last bio, and I will make this one fast. Jenny Ireland lost her father when she was a young child, and her mother moved the family to Healdsburg for the opening of Healdsburg College in 1882, where she got some of her elementary education. By age 15, she was working for the Pacific Press, and then she went off to Battle Creek College, graduated in 1894. And Jenny's claim to fame is that she planted the first Black Adventist church west of the Mississippi. Seems like a name that we should know. That's a pretty significant contribution. Now, I say she planted, but she and her local team planted it. She was an empowering leader. In 1906, James Furlong divided up a tract of land, thus it's known as the Furlong Tract, and decided to sell to Black citizens. And there was a very forward-thinking group of Black citizens in Los Angeles at this time, many of whom had migrated from the South, or their parents had, and they had landed there and were building up society. And Jenny, who was an innovator in her own right, resonated with this group as they were building their community in Furlong Tract. And so she grew in her conviction that she needed to work among them evangelistically. Okay. So she shared this conviction with the prayer meeting group one night, and a friend, Sarah Kane, later called her and said, actually, my postman lives in Furlong Tract. His name is Theodore Troy. Let's see if we can find him. So the two ladies go out on the streets and they accost the poor postman as he's making his deliveries and ask if they can start a Bible study in his home. And he agrees. And this begins this church. But she ends up pastoring that church for 6 years. while she's pastoring it, Willie White takes an interest in it. And as he's writing to others about this, he makes this comment to Arthur Spalding that Jenny Ireland is this little mother of the church. It's an interesting colored church, he says, and that she's this interesting person you want to visit with. And he's recommending that Arthur Spalding visit with her, but he calls her a little mother. And I wonder if that may indicate a category that female leaders were sometimes placed in. Whatever the case, she also then plants a church in 1912 over in Watts, along with two of the ladies that she had trained in the Bible work, Murtis Beeman and Estelle Hendricks, a couple of other ladies worth exploring. And she is this ultimate mentor. She works with this very forward-thinking group of people as a partner, empowering everyone with the tools they need to succeed in the mission. And as a result, some of the most significant leaders in Black Adventism emerged from her little church. People like Owen Troy, who became the first Adventist to receive a doctoral degree in theology. Also, Ruth Temple, doctor I mentioned earlier, who was an innovator in public health in Los Angeles area, and really throughout much of Southern California, was also someone who came from her church. Arna Bontam, one of the architects of the Harlem Renaissance, came from this little church. So not only was she a pastor of the church planter, she was also an empowering leader. And I think I need to stop there.
I must say, I was thoroughly impressed, thoroughly inspired, and refreshed by that presentation. Thank you very much, my friend James, very much. As a father of three girls, it really heartens me to see things like this. It's amazing. Two of my girls are very active in church, and when I get a chance to share this with them, they may be the ones that might help you to get this, in documentary form or something to that effect. I have a pair of twins, and what I was planning to come and say to you is, in agreement with one of the persons here, this should be in a book and documentary form. Unfortunately, we live in the TikTok, YouTube era, and for this to achieve the velocity that most of us would want, we would need to compress these stories into bite size, I'm thinking. And you can have a long form documentary. A lot of people love that, but putting some of these into a daisy chain of stories, that could also work too.
Good idea.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I just love it. I just absolutely love it. And let me pull out one of the most powerful bits that stood out for me as I wrap up. I can't remember her name right now, but I know you will as soon as I mention the detail. She sees all of these challenges in front of her, and you mentioned them she writes them one by one, and she goes down in prayer. In prayer, the Lord says to her, "My grace is sufficient." A still small voice lights a match and triggers a dynamite of action in her heart and in her being, and she goes out and does the thing. And that is so powerful. Still small voice, just like Elijah. Running from Jezebel, running, and he is suicidal, and the still small voice was not in the hurricane or not in the wind or any of those forces confronting him. God said to him, God says to her, "My grace is sufficient." And these stories are powerful, not just for women, but for men like us, and for all of God's children who want to be mobilized and to move forward with the power of God's Spirit in their hearts and in their souls to do more. Thank you.